Mom, you told us you'd pay for this. My son insisted about a bill I never agreed to cover. When I denied it, he exchanged knowing looks with his sister and said, "Your memory isn't what it used to be." That's when I realized what they were really doing. My name is Betty, and at 60 years old, I had always prided myself on having a sharp mind, an excellent memory, and the ability to manage my own affairs with the same competence I had demonstrated throughout my adult life. I could remember phone numbers from decades ago, recall conversations in precise detail, and keep track of my finances, appointments, and commitments without any assistance from anyone else. But over the past 6 months, my family had been planting seeds of doubt about my cognitive abilities with such subtle persistence that I had begun to question my own mind. It started with small comments that seemed caring and concerned rather than manipulative. "Mom, you mentioned that story about your neighbor's dog twice during lunch," my daughter Sarah would say with gentle concern. "Are you feeling okay?"
Did I?
I would respond, genuinely unsure, because the conversation had covered many topics, and I might very well have repeated something without realizing it. "Mom, you asked me the same question about my work schedule yesterday," my son Michael would observe. "Maybe you should write things down so you don't forget." Each incident, taken individually, was easily dismissed as normal forgetfulness. That happens to everyone regardless of age. But collectively, these observations created a narrative that my memory was declining and that I needed to be more careful about trusting my own recollections. The pattern escalated gradually, with my children pointing out supposed memory lapses with increasing frequency and growing concern. "Mom, you promised to call Aunt Helen yesterday, but you didn't," Sarah would say. "When I reminded you about it, you seemed confused about what I was talking about." "I don't remember promising to call Aunt Helen," I would reply. "See? That's exactly what I'm worried about. You're forgetting conversations we had just hours earlier." The gaslighting was so subtle and consistent that I began keeping a small notebook to track my commitments, conversations, and daily activities. I told myself this was just good organization, but deep down I was starting to worry that my family's concerns about my memory might be legitimate. The breakthrough moment, the moment I realized what was really happening, came during a family dinner at Michael's house in early October. As we finished dessert, Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a receipt. "Mom, here's the receipt from the contractor who repaired Sarah's roof last month. You said you'd cover the cost since it was storm damage, and she's been struggling financially." I stared at the receipt showing charges of $3,200 for roofing work. I had absolutely no memory of agreeing to pay for Sarah's roof repairs. "Michael, I never agreed to pay for Sarah's roof." "Mom, we talked about this extensively. You said that family helps family, and that you wanted to help Sarah get back on her feet after her divorce. I would remember agreeing to spend over $3,000 on someone else's roof repairs." Michael and Sarah exchanged the kind of look that passes between people who share knowledge that the third person is missing. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "your memory isn't what it used to be. We've all noticed that you're forgetting conversations, commitments, and things you've said." "I'm not forgetting anything. I never agreed to pay for your roof." "Mom," Michael said with exaggerated patience, "this is exactly what we're talking about. You're forgetting conversations that happened just last month." The conversation continued with both of my children providing detailed accounts of a discussion that supposedly took place at Sarah's house, where I had apparently offered to pay for the roof repairs as part of helping her establish financial stability after her divorce. Their accounts were consistent, detailed, and delivered with the kind of sincere concern that made questioning them feel churlish and paranoid. But I absolutely knew that I had never agreed to spend $3,200 on Sarah's roof. That night, I went home and searched through my own financial records, my calendar, and my personal notes. There was no record of any conversation about Sarah's roof, no note about agreeing to pay for repairs, no indication that I had ever been asked to contribute to this expense. But more importantly, there was no record of storm damage to Sarah's house. I checked weather reports for the previous months and found no severe storms in her area that would have caused the kind of damage requiring $3,200 in roof repairs. As I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the evidence, I realized that my children weren't concerned about my declining memory. They were systematically creating false memories and then questioning my sanity when I couldn't recall events that had never actually happened. The roof repair story was a fabrication designed to extract money from me, while making me doubt my own cognitive abilities when I couldn't remember agreeing to pay for something I had never been asked to pay for. But this revelation raised a terrifying question. How many other forgotten conversations, commitments, and agreements were actually lies designed to make me question my own mind? As I began to review months of interactions with my children through this new lens, I realized that their concern about my memory problems coincided perfectly with an escalating series of requests for financial assistance, help with their personal problems, and involvement in their lives that I couldn't remember agreeing to provide. My children weren't worried about my memory, they were weaponizing doubt about my memory to control my finances, manipulate my decisions, and make me dependent on their version of events, rather than trusting my own recollections. But what they didn't know was that their supposedly confused mother was about to start documenting everything, and prove that her memory was not only intact but sharp enough to expose their manipulation and lies. The day after the roof repair confrontation, I began what would become the most important investigation of my life, systematically documenting every interaction with my children to determine which of us was telling the truth about my memory and mental state. I purchased a digital recorder, a detailed calendar system, and a secure notebook where I could track conversations, commitments, and any discrepancies between what I remembered and what my children claimed had happened. The first test came 2 days later when Sarah called to ask about helping with her daughter's wedding expenses. Mom, remember we talked about contributing to Emma's wedding fund? You said you wanted to help make her day special since it's her first wedding. And she's been so responsible about saving money. Sarah, I don't remember any conversation about Emma's wedding fund. Mom, we talked about this last week when you were at my house for dinner. You said you'd think about contributing $5,000 to help with the venue and flowers. I had indeed been to Sarah's house for dinner the previous week, and I had perfect recall of our conversation. We had talked about Emma's engagement, her fiancé's job prospects, and general wedding planning, but there had been absolutely no discussion of wedding expenses or any financial contribution from me. Sarah, can you tell me exactly when this conversation took place and what else we talked about that evening? It was last Tuesday after dinner when we were having coffee in the living room. We also talked about Emma's dress shopping and how excited she is about the venue they chose. Sarah's account was partially accurate. We had talked about the dress shopping and the venue, but she was inserting a fictional conversation about financial contributions into the middle of a real conversation, then using my accurate memory of the real parts to validate the false parts. This was sophisticated gaslighting. Sarah was weaving lies into truthful recollections in ways that made questioning her version of events seem like evidence of memory problems, rather than evidence of her deception. I told Sarah I would think about the wedding contribution and ended the call, then immediately wrote a detailed account of both conversations, the real one from the previous week and the current phone call. The second test came 3 days later when Michael arrived at my house with paperwork he claimed I had requested. Mom, here are the financial planning documents you asked me to bring over. You said you wanted me to review your investment portfolio and make recommendations about managing your retirement accounts. Michael, I never asked you to review my investments. Mom, we talked about this on Sunday after church. You said you were feeling overwhelmed by financial decisions and wanted professional help managing your money. I had seen Michael after church on Sunday, and we had talked about general topics, the weather, his children's activities, plans for upcoming holidays, but there had been no discussion of my finances, no expression of feeling overwhelmed, and certainly no request for him to manage my money. Michael, can you tell me what specifically I said about feeling overwhelmed? Michael's answer was telling. You said that keeping track of all the investment accounts and financial paperwork was getting too complicated for someone your age, and that you trusted me to help you make better decisions about your money. The phrasing was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with his agenda to gain control over my finances. Real conversations don't include phrases like someone your age, or perfectly articulated requests for help that happen to match exactly what the other person wants to do. Michael, I never said any of those things. Mom, this is exactly what Sarah and I are worried about. You're forgetting entire conversations that happened just days ago. Michael's response revealed the pattern. Create a false conversation, present it as fact, then use my accurate denial as evidence of memory problems that required their intervention and assistance. I told Michael I didn't need help with my investments and asked him to leave the paperwork, then wrote a detailed account of both the real Sunday conversation and the current manipulation attempt. The third test confirmed that this was a coordinated campaign rather than individual misunderstandings. My youngest daughter Jennifer called to discuss holiday plans, and within minutes, she was referencing another fictional conversation. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said regarding hosting Christmas this year. You're probably right that it's getting to be too much work for someone in your 70s. Jennifer, I never said Christmas hosting was too much work. Mom, just last week you mentioned that all the cooking and cleaning and coordinating was exhausting you, and that maybe it was time to let someone else take over holiday hosting. I had never said anything remotely similar to this. I loved hosting Christmas dinner, had been doing it successfully for over 30 years, and had never expressed any desire to give up the tradition. Jennifer, I would never say that Christmas hosting exhausts me. I love preparing holiday meals for our family. Mom, you're forgetting again. We had this exact conversation when you were worried about whether you could handle all the preparation work. 3 children, 3 fictional conversations, all following the same pattern. Create a false memory that served their interests. Present it as undeniable fact, then use my accurate denials as evidence of cognitive decline that required their intervention. But the most revealing aspect of their coordination was the consistency of their language. All 3 of them used phrases like someone your age, getting too complicated, and we're worried about you. Language that suggested they had discussed and planned this approach together. My children weren't individually concerned about my memory. They were collectively implementing a strategy to convince me that my mind was failing so they could justify taking control of my finances, my decisions, and my independence. The documentation I was keeping revealed not only that my memory was perfectly intact, but that my children were systematically lying to me in ways designed to make me doubt my own sanity. But what I discovered next would show me that this manipulation campaign was far more extensive and dangerous than I had initially realized. 2 weeks into my documentation project, I discovered that my children's memory manipulation extended far beyond fabricated conversations about money and responsibilities. They had been systematically rewriting our family history and enlisting other people to participate in their campaign to convince me that my cognitive abilities were declining. The revelation came during a phone call with my sister Margaret, who lives in another state and usually stays in touch through weekly conversations about family news and general life updates. Betty, I'm concerned about what Michael told me regarding your memory problems, Margaret said without preamble during what I had expected to be a routine catch-up call. What did Michael tell you? He said you've been forgetting conversations, missing appointments, and having trouble managing your finances. He's worried that you might be developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Michael had contacted my sister to discuss my supposed cognitive decline without my knowledge or permission, presenting himself as a concerned son dealing with a mother who was losing her mental faculties. Margaret, I don't have memory problems. I haven't missed any appointments, and I manage my finances just fine. Betty, honey, Michael said, you've been denying that these problems exist. He said that's typical people in early stages of cognitive decline. They don't recognize their own symptoms. This was particularly insidious gaslighting. Michael had preemptively explained to Margaret that my denials of memory problems were themselves evidence of memory problems, creating a logical trap where anything I said in my own defense would be interpreted as confirmation of his claims. Margaret, what specific examples did Michael give you about my supposed memory problems? He said, you forgot that you promised to pay for Sarah's roof repairs, that you couldn't remember asking him to help with your investments, and that you've been repeating stories and asking the same questions multiple times during conversations. Every example Margaret cited was one of the fictional conversations my children had been using to build their case against my mental competence. Michael had taken their fabricated incidents and presented them to my sister as factual evidence of cognitive decline. Margaret, none of those things actually happened. Michael is lying about my memory to justify taking control of my affairs. Betty, that's exactly what Michael said you would say. He warned me that you're becoming paranoid and defensive about your memory problems. Margaret's response revealed the perfect circular logic of their strategy. Any denial I made would be interpreted as evidence that I was losing touch with reality, while any attempt to defend my cognitive abilities would be seen as proof that I was becoming paranoid and defensive about my condition. Michael had essentially immunized his lies against contradiction by framing any objections I might raise as symptoms of the very condition he was claiming I had developed. But Margaret's call also revealed something else. My children were building a case against my mental competence that extended beyond our immediate family. They were creating a narrative about my cognitive decline that involved other relatives, potentially friends, and possibly even medical professionals. This wasn't just about manipulating me, it was about manipulating everyone in my social network to accept their version of my mental state and support whatever interventions they decided were necessary for my protection. The second revelation came 2 days later when my neighbor Mrs. Patterson mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Betty, Sarah stopped by yesterday while you were at your doctor's appointment. She wanted me to keep an eye on you because she's worried about your safety living alone." "What did Sarah tell you?" "She said you've been having memory problems and that the family is concerned you might forget to turn off the stove or lock the doors. She asked me to watch for any signs that you're becoming confused or disoriented." Sarah had enlisted my neighbor to monitor my behavior for evidence of cognitive decline, creating a surveillance network that would report back to my children about my daily activities and mental state. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't have memory problems, and I don't need anyone to monitor my safety." "Oh, honey," Sarah said, "you might not realize that you're having difficulties. She seems very concerned about you." Mrs. Patterson's response showed how effective my children's campaign had been. They had convinced people who cared about me that I was losing my ability to recognize my own limitations, and that their surveillance and intervention were necessary for my protection. But the most shocking discovery came when I called my doctor's office to schedule a routine appointment and learned that Sarah had already been in contact with my medical providers. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter Sarah called last week to discuss her concerns about your memory and cognitive function. My doctor's receptionist informed me. She wanted to know if we could schedule a comprehensive neurological evaluation. Sarah is not authorized to discuss my medical care with you. She said she was concerned that you might not be aware that you need evaluation, and that the family is worried about your ability to make medical decisions for yourself." Sarah had contacted my doctor's office to discuss my supposed cognitive decline and request medical testing that I hadn't consented to, positioning herself as a concerned family member dealing with a patient who might not be competent to manage her own health care. This revelation made me realize that my children's campaign wasn't just about gaining control over my finances or my daily decisions. They were building a legal and medical case that would allow them to claim guardianship or conservatorship if I continued to resist their management of my life. By creating a documented pattern of supposed memory problems, enlisting witnesses to confirm their concerns, and involving medical professionals in their narrative about my cognitive decline, they were laying the groundwork to have me declared legally incompetent if their manipulation tactics weren't sufficient to achieve their goals. But what they didn't know was that their supposedly confused mother had been documenting every lie, every manipulation, and every attempt to recruit others into their conspiracy against my mental competence. The evidence I was gathering would not only prove that my memory was intact, but that my children were engaged in a systematic campaign, a psychological abuse, designed to steal my independence and control my life. Armed with the knowledge that my children were conducting a coordinated campaign to convince everyone in my life that I was developing dementia, I began a counter-investigation that would expose their lies and prove that my cognitive abilities were not only intact, but sharp enough to outmaneuver their manipulation. The first step was to establish objective evidence of my mental competence through professional evaluation. I scheduled an appointment with a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in cognitive assessment, specifically requesting a comprehensive evaluation that would document my memory, reasoning ability, and overall mental state. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was a highly respected specialist who had been recommended by my primary care physician. During our 2-hour evaluation, she conducted detailed testing of my memory, attention, problem-solving skills, and cognitive function. "Mrs. Johnson, I want to be very clear about my findings," Dr. Morrison said, as we concluded the assessment. "Your cognitive function is excellent for someone of any age. Your memory, both short-term and long-term, is well above average. Your reasoning ability, attention span, and mental processing speed are all within the superior range." "Dr. Morrison, what about the concerns my family has raised about my memory problems?" "Based on this evaluation, there is absolutely no evidence of memory impairment, cognitive decline, or any condition that would affect your ability to make decisions, manage your affairs, or live independently." Dr. Morrison's report provided official documentation that my mental faculties were not only normal but exceptionally strong, directly contradicting every claim my children had made about my cognitive decline. But I needed more than medical evidence. I needed to prove that my children were deliberately lying about conversations and events that had never occurred. The second step was to create controlled tests that would expose their deception in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I began recording all phone conversations with my children. Legally, since my state allows single-party consent for recording. I also started keeping detailed written records of every in-person interaction, including dates, times, locations, and witnesses when available. The first trap I set was with Sarah during a phone call where I mentioned considering a vacation to Europe. "I've been thinking about taking a trip to Italy next spring," I told Sarah during our conversation. "That sounds wonderful, Mom. I think you'd really enjoy seeing the art museums and historical sites. I'll need to start planning and saving money for the trip. Let me know if you need help with any of the arrangements." The conversation was pleasant and straightforward, with no discussion of financial assistance from me to her, no requests for help with her problems, and no mention of any commitments on my part. 3 days later, Sarah called back with a fabricated follow-up conversation. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said regarding helping with my son's college tuition. I really appreciate your offer to contribute $1,500 toward his spring semester expenses." "Sarah, I never offered to pay for your son's college tuition." "Mom, we talked about this when you mentioned your Europe trip. You said that family education was more important than vacation spending." This was exactly the pattern I had documented. Sarah was inserting a fictional conversation about financial contributions into the context of a real conversation about travel plans, then presenting the fabrication as fact. But this time I had recorded evidence of the original conversation that proved no such discussion had ever taken place. "Sarah, I have the recording of our conversation about my Europe trip. We never discussed your son's tuition or any financial contribution from me." "You recorded our conversation?" "I record all our conversations now, Sarah, because you keep claiming I said things that I never said." Sarah's response was immediate and revealing. "Mom, recording private family conversations is paranoid behavior. This is exactly the kind of thing that shows your judgment is becoming impaired." Sarah's attempt to frame my documentation as evidence of paranoia, rather than evidence of her lies, revealed the depth of her commitment to the gaslighting campaign. The second trap involved Michael in a fictional emergency that supposedly required my immediate financial assistance. During a pleasant dinner at my house, Michael mentioned that his car was making strange noises and would probably need repair soon. "I hope it's not anything expensive," I replied sympathetically. "Me too. Car repairs always seem to come at the worst possible time." That was the extent of our discussion about his car problems. 2 days later, Michael called with an urgent request based on a conversation that had never happened. "Mom, I need to use the $1,500 you offered to loan me for my car repairs. The transmission failed completely, and I need to get it fixed immediately to get to work." "Michael, I never offered to loan you money for car repairs." "Mom, we talked about this at dinner on Tuesday. You said that if my car needed expensive repairs, you would help me out because you know things are tight financially for our family right now." Again, Michael was weaving a fictional offer of financial assistance into the context of a real conversation about his car troubles, then treating my accurate denial as evidence of memory problems. "Michael, I have detailed notes from our Tuesday dinner conversation. We discussed your car making noises, but I never offered any money for repairs." "Mom, the fact that you're keeping detailed notes about family conversations is concerning. It suggests you're becoming obsessive and paranoid about your memory." Michael's response was identical to Sarah's. Any evidence I provided of their lies was reframed as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. The third trap was the most elaborate and involved all 3 children in a coordinated lie that I could definitively disprove. I mentioned during separate conversations with each child that I was considering updating my will to include charitable donations. "I've been thinking about leaving some money to the children's hospital in my will," I told each of them during different phone calls. All 3 responded positively, saying they thought charitable giving was admirable and that they supported my decision to help causes I cared about. 1 week later, all 3 children arrived at my house together for what they claimed was a family meeting I had requested. "Mom, we're here to discuss the family meeting you called about changing your will," Jennifer announced, as they settled into my living room. "I never called a family meeting about my will. Mom, you called each of us separately and asked us to come over today to discuss your decision to leave most of your estate to charity instead of to your family," Sarah added. That's not true. I mentioned considering charitable donations, but I never called a family meeting, and I never said anything about leaving most of my estate to charity. Michael delivered the coordinated response. Mom, this is exactly what we're talking about. You're forgetting major conversations and decisions that happened just days ago. But this time I had them trapped completely. Because I had recorded all 3 separate phone calls where I mentioned charitable giving, and none of those conversations included any request for a family meeting or any statement about leaving most of my estate to charity. I have recordings of all 3 conversations where I mentioned charitable giving, I announced, pulling out my digital recorder. None of those conversations included any request for a family meeting, and I never said anything about leaving most of my estate to charity. The room fell silent as my children realized that their latest manipulation attempt had been completely documented and could be easily disproved. Mom, Jennifer said desperately, secretly recording family conversations is evidence of paranoid thinking. People with dementia often become suspicious and start documenting things obsessively. Jennifer, people with dementia don't conduct systematic investigations that expose coordinated lies. People with dementia don't create detailed documentation that proves their families are gaslighting them. For the first time since their campaign began, my children had no response to offer, because the evidence of their deception was overwhelming and undeniable. But they were about to learn that their supposedly confused mother had been building a case that would expose their manipulation to everyone they had involved in their conspiracy against her mental competence. Armed with months of documentation proving that my children had been systematically lying about my memory and mental state, I decided it was time to expose their manipulation campaign to everyone they had enlisted in their conspiracy against my cognitive competence. The first person I contacted was my sister Margaret, who had been convinced by Michael that I was developing dementia and becoming paranoid about my memory problems. Margaret, I need to play some recordings for you that will explain what's really been happening with my so's memory problems. I played the recorded conversations that proved my children had been fabricating discussions about financial commitments, then lying about my denials as evidence of cognitive decline. Margaret listened in stunned silence as she heard clear evidence that Michael had been lying to her about my mental state. Betty, this is horrifying. Michael told me you were becoming paranoid and defensive, but you weren't paranoid, you were being gaslighted. Margaret, they've been systematically creating false memories and then using my accurate denials as evidence that I need their help managing my life. But why would they do this to their own mother? Because they want control over my finances and my decisions, and they've discovered that questioning my mental competence is more effective than trying to convince me to voluntarily give up my independence. Margaret's response was immediate and decisive. Betty, this is elder abuse. What they're doing to you is psychological abuse designed to steal your autonomy and your assets. The second person I contacted was my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been recruited by Sarah to monitor my behavior for signs of confusion or disorientation. Mrs. Patterson, I need to show you something that will explain why my daughter asked you to watch me for signs of mental decline. I played the recorded conversations that proved Sarah had been lying about my memory problems and creating fictional scenarios to justify her claims about my cognitive decline. Mrs. Patterson was shocked by the evidence of deliberate deception. Betty, I had no idea your children were lying to me about your condition. Sarah made it sound like you were having serious memory problems that put your safety at risk. Mrs. Patterson, as you can see from these recordings, my memory is perfect. Sarah has been manipulating everyone in my life to believe I'm developing dementia so she can justify controlling my decisions. This is terrible, Betty. I feel like I was tricked into spying on you for your own children. The third confrontation was with Dr. Morrison, who needed to know that my children had been contacting my medical providers without authorization and making false claims about my mental state. Dr. Morrison, I need you to know that my family has been contacting medical offices to discuss my supposed cognitive decline, and they've been lying about my mental state to justify medical interventions I don't need. I provided Dr. Morrison with documentation of Sarah's unauthorized contact with my doctor's office and the false claims she had made about my cognitive function. Mrs. Johnson, this is a serious violation of your privacy and your right to control your own medical care. Your daughter had no legal authority to discuss your health care with medical providers, and her false claims about your cognitive state constitute a form of medical fraud. Dr. Morrison agreed to document Sarah's unauthorized contact and false claims in my medical record, creating an official record of the attempted manipulation of my healthcare. But the most important confrontation was with my children themselves, who needed to understand that their manipulation campaign had been completely exposed and documented. I invited all 3 children to my house for what I told them was an important family discussion about my estate planning and future care needs, language I knew would ensure their attendance because they believed it represented an opportunity to gain control over my affairs. When they arrived, they found my living room set up like a conference room, with a digital recorder, printed transcripts of conversations, medical documentation, and a comprehensive timeline of their manipulation campaign laid out on my coffee table. Before we begin, I announced, I want you to know that this entire conversation is being recorded and that I have invited my attorney to listen to the recording afterward, to advise me about legal remedies for the psychological abuse you've been inflicting on me. My children's faces went white as they realized that their victim had been building a case against them. Mom, what is all this? Sarah asked, gesturing at the documents. This is evidence of your coordinated campaign to convince me and everyone else that I'm developing dementia so you can classify taking control of my life and my assets. I began playing recorded conversations that proved they had been lying about financial commitments I had supposedly made, family meetings I had supposedly called, and memory problems I had supposedly demonstrated. These recordings prove that you've been systematically creating false conversations and then using my accurate denials as evidence of cognitive decline that requires your intervention. Michael tried to interrupt. Mom, we were concerned about your welfare. Michael, you were concerned about your own financial welfare. These recordings prove that every supposed memory problem you've evinced was actually a lie you told to extract money from me or gain control over my decisions. I continued presenting evidence. The medical evaluation that proved my cognitive function was superior. The documentation of their unauthorized contacts with my healthcare providers. The testimony from family and friends who had been manipulated into participating in their conspiracy. You've spent months trying to convince me that I couldn't trust my own mind. You've enlisted family members, neighbors, and medical professionals in a campaign to destroy my confidence in my own mental abilities. Jennifer made one last desperate attempt to maintain their narrative. Mom, collecting all this evidence and making these accusations sounds paranoid. Maybe you should talk to someone about why you're feeling so suspicious of your own family. Jennifer, paranoid people don't conduct systematic investigations that expose coordinated lies. Paranoid people don't gather evidence that proves their suspicions are justified. People with memory problems don't create detailed documentation that contradicts false claims about their cognitive abilities. I handed each of them a folder containing copies of all the evidence I had gathered about their manipulation campaign. These folders contain proof of your lies, your unauthorized contacts with my medical providers, your attempts to recruit others, to monitor my behavior, and your systematic campaign to destroy my confidence in my own mental abilities. What do you want from us? Patricia asked quietly. I want you to acknowledge that you've been lying to me. And about me. I want you to contact everyone you've told about my supposed memory problems and correct those false statements. And I want you to understand that your access to my life, my home, and my resources now depends on your willingness to treat me with honesty and respect. The conversation ended with my children understanding that their supposedly confused mother had outsmarted them completely and had documented their psychological abuse in ways that could have serious legal consequences. But the most important outcome was the realization that my mind was not only intact, but sharp enough to protect me from people who would use doubt and manipulation to steal my autonomy and independence. 6 months after exposing my children's memory manipulation campaign, I had not only reclaimed my confidence in my own cognitive abilities, but had become an advocate for other elderly people who were experiencing similar psychological abuse from family members who sought to control their lives through gaslighting and manufactured doubt. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation had been difficult, but necessary. My children were forced to acknowledge that they had been lying about my memory problems, and that their campaign to question my mental competence had been motivated by their desire to control my finances and decisions rather than genuine concern for my welfare. Sarah was the first to offer a genuine apology, though it took several weeks for her to fully process the magnitude of what she had done. Mom, I need you to know that I'm horrified by my own behavior, she said during a phone call 1 month after the exposure. I convinced myself that I was helping you, but I was actually trying to manipulate you into becoming dependent on my management of your life. Sarah? What made you realize that your behavior was wrong? Listening to the recordings of my own lies, hearing myself create fictional conversations, and then accuse you of memory problems when you accurately denied saying things you had never said. I sounded like someone I wouldn't want to know, let alone be related to. Sarah's acknowledgement led to a slow rebuilding of our relationship, based on honesty rather than manipulation, but it required her to accept that I was fully competent to manage my own affairs and make my own decisions about my life and my resources. Michael's recognition of his abusive behavior was more gradual and required him to confront his own financial motivations for wanting to control my assets. Mom, I realize now that I was more concerned about my inheritance than your well-being, he admitted during a difficult conversation 2 months after the confrontation. I was afraid that if you maintained control over your money, you might spend it on things I didn't approve of or give it to causes that wouldn't benefit me. Michael, what scared you about my independence? The possibility that you might make decisions I disagreed with, or that you might not leave me as much money as I was counting on receiving. I convinced myself that questioning your mental abilities was protecting you, but I was really trying to protect my own financial interests. Michael's honesty about his motivations was painful, but necessary for rebuilding trust between us. He had to accept that my money was mine to manage and spend as I chose, regardless of his preferences or expectations. Jennifer's journey toward acknowledgement was the most difficult because she had been the primary coordinator of the manipulation campaign and had the most invested in maintaining the narrative that I needed their protection and management. Mom, I still think we had legitimate concerns about your living alone and managing everything independently, she said during our first conversation after the confrontation. Jennifer, your concerns weren't legitimate. They were manufactured. You created false evidence of memory problems that didn't exist in order to justify taking control over my life. But Mom, even if we handled it badly, the underlying worry about your safety and security was real. Jennifer, worrying about someone's safety doesn't justify lying to them about their mental state. Being concerned about someone's security doesn't give you the right to manipulate them into doubting their own sanity. It took Jennifer nearly 4 months to acknowledge that her behavior had constituted psychological abuse rather than protective concern, but her eventual recognition was complete and sincere. Mom, I need you to know that what we did to you was cruel and wrong. We gaslighted you, lied about you to other people, and tried to destroy